do that. John Hughes was inclined to be fully backed by collateral and real estate, if possible, for the loans that he made. He's a very clever fellow, a lawyer, and very sharp by all accounts. And he was able to offer his clients good deals in terms of loans quite often, but he never did it on what they call a guts and hide basis, which is where it takes guts to do it, and those involved stand to lose their hide. He wanted to be backed by collateral, and he did so in a way with the Dale Burr situation that may have contributed materially to the problem. And I'm not saying that what the banker did in any way justified what happened, because the banker could be the biggest jerk in the world and, you know, do this, that, and the other, and he did not deserve to die, and he did not deserve to die in the horrible fashion that he came to his end. But less than a year before the tragedy of December 9th, 1985, the Burrs, this is Dale and Emily, went into the Hills Bank and had a long meeting, actually a couple of meetings with John Hughes, and out of this came essentially a refinancing of their debt obligation with the Hills Bank. And in exchange for writing off or delaying collecting approximately $30,000 in interest that was due from the Burrs to be paid to the Hills Bank that spring, the spring of 1985. The Hills Bank obtained a mortgage on 160 acres of additional farmland owned by the Burrs, and this 160 acres was in fact the home place, which in farm communities and farm jargon means, you know, the place where they actually live, and the one which is of course the closest to the heart and the soul of the people involved. So this property was worth $250,000, $300,000, perhaps more. It's worth a good deal of money, and the bank obtained the mortgage on this for no money out of pocket, because what they were essentially doing was putting off or postponing an interest payment what was due in exchange for collateral worth over $250,000. Less than 2 months after this refinancing of the Burr debt, and less than 2 months after the Burrs thought that they had taken care of their problem with the Hills Bank, John Hughes wrote to Dale and Emily and threatened foreclosure in no uncertain terms. And you know, there are many ways of looking at the evidence and the facts at hand, and people will draw different conclusions. But my view is that it is rather unusual to enter into a 30-year mortgage of sizable nature with a lender, and then to find the lender less than 2 months later coming back and basically threatening to foreclose on the property that you have just put up as collateral for this loan, which theoretically took care of everything. That threat of foreclosure was repeated by the deeds of the bank and by the statements of the bank as the year progressed. And as the winter rolled around and the commodity prices continued to deteriorate and the situation became increasingly bleak for people in the Midwest particularly, especially family farmers, and especially in Iowa, this became a real problem and a driving or force or impetus behind what forced Dale to his problem.
And to make matters worse, he had started out his life debt-free on that family farm.
Right. In fact, many would argue that Dale was unprepared for the situation he found him in because of the privileged nature of his youth and his years growing up. His father was director of the local bank, as his grandfather had been before him, and they owned, the Burrs owned thousands of acres. This is not Dale per se, but the family clan owned or controlled thousands of acres, and Dale's father and Dale owned several hundred. They were very well situated, marvelous farmland, without any debts, and with a direct line of access to the local bank, which is ideal, you know, from the standpoint of a farmer. Situation changed radically. The Burrs lost their connection to the bank in the 70s when Dale's father sold his shares, and this removed that particular connection. Another major change that happened was the Nixon administration was successful in essentially dismantling the New Deal price and production controls that had been in effect for nearly half a century. And Dale had never known anything else. His entire farming career had been carried out under the surviving New Deal crop and price restraints. They were as much as part of the local scene as thunderheads in the afternoon. And in the early 70s, when these programs were done away with, the situation changed. And so Dale found himself in a situation where it was a quote-unquote free market economy, and he had no contact with the bank, or at least they did not control the bank. And these were significant changes in his situation.
I'm wondering whether you chose the Dale Burrow family to focus on it, to tell the story as a way of telling the story of the farm crisis for happening throughout the area.
Well, certainly it was in my mind. In fact, if I could very briefly do so, I should tell you how I came to do this. I was sitting at home in Washington State on a rainy afternoon in January, and I got a call on the phone, and it was a person I did not know and I'd never spoken to, an editor at a publishing house in New York. And she said, "Gosh, how'd you like to write a book on the Dale Burr tragedy keyed to the farm crisis?" And I tried to explain to her why I thought it was a good idea, but I was not the one. Didn't live in the Midwest, although I have experience in farming, not in grain farming as it's practiced in the Midwest. And I'm squeamish, frankly. In fact, I even on the phone told her the story of the time my wife cut her finger while we were fixing dinner, and I was trying to be, the man about the house, and I was holding her finger and trying to staunch the blood, and I passed out, fell in the bathtub. I basically told the woman who called everything I could to suggest that I wasn't the person. She persevered for a number of reasons that I won't go into now, basically because she was familiar with my work, with my previous book, Mountain in the Clouds. But from the outset, my idea was that the situation, the story that had unfolded on the 9th of December 1985 was uncommon in the violence that it contained and in the horrible, disfiguring nature of the violence and the multiple murders, but that it was common and not uncommon at all in terms of the forces and the factors which had driven the various individuals to the positions which had enabled the thing to happen. In other words, I saw the triple murder-suicide as atypical in terms of the severity or the nature of the response, but I saw the factors, the forces that brought it about as very typical of what people were experiencing in the Midwest and actually in farm communities all over the country. I live in Washington State. Washington State, is not often thought of perhaps as a farming state, but as a matter of fact, farm produce is the largest cash, I want to say crop, obviously the largest cash crop, but the largest producer of cash revenue in the state of Washington. And if you look at the United States, you will find that that is true in many more areas than the Midwest. And I saw the same thing happening in my own community. I live in a dairy farming community, and it's different with dairy farmers than it is with grain farmers because the price supports are different, the bureaucracy is set up differently. It's not identical comparison from one to the other, but the basic trend of people being forced off the land, often unwillingly, increasing size of farms, increasing reliance on mechanization, and all of the attendant factors is happening in Washington just as much as it's happening in Iowa. And so I hoped through this story, this really sad and unfortunate tragedy, to be able to reach through and touch something which was very common, something which relates to a lot of people who've never held a shotgun in their hand and thought about killing anyone, and who never will, but whose lives may be driven by some of these same forces.
So you're saying that the seeds of this tragedy may be sown already in other communities too?
Well, farmers are in trouble all over, perhaps slightly less now than 3 or 4 years ago, although it still goes on. And, most people don't go out and kill someone when they find themselves confronted with a serious problem in their life. I mean, we all have problems, one degree of severity or another, and most of us don't commit murder or suicide.
But you made a good analogy at some point in the book where you compared it to the Greek tragedy with the character's fatal flaw, and it seems as if that may have
Well, you
played
know, not
into
only, I thought it was apt. I mean, as a student of Greek tragedy, I thought it was very apt, but not just that there was a fatal flaw that was revealed under pressure, but that many of Dale's weaknesses or character drawbacks or flaws were also intimately related to his virtues. The idea that strength and virtue is almost indivisible. Dale was a person who loved his son a great deal, perhaps above all else. That love of his son was one of the things that got him in the position of financially backing his son in a deal which went so bad that it threatened both of their farming operations. And it was love of his son which had gotten him, at least at the outset, into it. Dale was a person who was conventional in the sense that he believed what, as an example, authority figures told him. As an example, bankers. He believed that the banker had his best interest in mind. He believed a lot of things that he was told, and had grown up with in that vein. And he thought of himself, I think, as a banker, kind of in an indirect sense, because the family had always been involved in banks. This was not some foreign alien force. This was something that he felt a certain connection to, and so he trusted him. And this trust, along with the love of the son, was something which allowed him to get into a situation which produced a real tragedy. And his love of his wife, his dedication to his wife, Emily. They were a very, very close couple. There was no marital difficulty that anyone, even the closest friends, knew about or saw. They were devoted to each other. And yet this love, in some fashion, perhaps combined with a sense of rejection or a sense that Emily didn't think he was doing it right, led to yet another tragedy. Good and bad, allied, and sometimes hard to separate.
And maybe indeed she was so much a part of his life that to kill himself meant killing her.
It could very well be. Some people in the family have explained it that way. Although I will confess, I see horribly disfiguring murder as a hard thing to harmonize with compassion. I mean, they just don't, to me,
it's like
to
the
go
opposite
together.
side of the coin, almost.
Right.
Yeah. Fascinating to me is the fact that the reader knows from the very beginning who the killer is in this story. Yet there's a lot of suspense in this book. I stayed up till 1 o'clock.
I'm glad to hear it. I'm delighted. I labored until blood came out at the temples, hoping that someone besides my mother would do that.
So tell me how you labored to build that suspense, because obviously there's a technique involved here.
Well, gosh, I'm a storyteller. That's my stock and trade, and the stories here are very strong. In my previous book, Mountain in the Clouds, I essentially had to invent a narrative because there wasn't, a chronological chain of events which carried me through the story I wanted to tell. I had to essentially create a first-person narrative, put myself in situations, and create a narrative out of intellectual shreds and ideas combined from various ways. In this story, the narrative just leaps out and grabs you by the throat. You've got a guy who in the space of an hour kills 3 people he knows very well and with whom he has had intimate relations, and then kills himself. And the relationships and the emotions involved in this are as strong as anything I've ever dealt with as a teller of stories. And that goes back a ways. It was almost like the thing wrote itself in the sense of that structuring. But what I tried to do, and I like to think one of the things that I bring to this story, is some kind of perspective or some kind of depth. And I tried very hard to combine the telling of how Dale stalked and killed these people he knew with a long view at certain facets of farm history, certain facets of American history, certain facets of the history of Western civilization, which seem to me to have real bearing on the story that unfolded in Lone Tree, Iowa on the 9th of December 1985, and to have real bearing for the farmers who are alive today, who are either doing well or still struggling and confronting with this thing that brought Dale down.
Certainly a suspense builder for me was your interspersing of the history of
I made you wait for the murders?
You made me wait. And sometimes I was mad at you. but it did a good job, and it also was interesting. I think many of us don't know this background of British enclosures and American agricultural history, and I thought it was fascinating, and I wondered if you came on this cold and decided to research it for this book, or whether this was a favorite topic and you already knew all this stuff.
Well, no, I didn't know it. In fact, just a little revelation about myself, one of the things that I try to do in projects I'm involved in is to learn. And so I don't usually try to write about things that I know everything under the sun about. Unfortunately, that doesn't apply to hardly anything. But I'm happiest when I'm learning about something. And so I had an idea. I mean, I come from an old farming family. I live on the farm that my grandfather got during the First World War and my father was raised on. My family can trace back their farming heritage into the early 18th century, into the 1750 or before, and through the labors of cousins of mine, some in Minnesota, as a matter of fact, I have been made aware of how my family came to this country and what their background was, and they were all farmers by and large. And so I had a certain perspective of the long view of the farmer here in 1989 and how, especially in families with a long tradition of it, how they might have gotten to that point. But a lot of it was research, and I was fascinated by some of this stuff, particularly the Roman analogy, which takes it even further back into a period where the analogies are in a way broader brush, but it seems to me equally striking. Specifically, in the latter days of the Roman Republic, there was a process which saw the rise of large farms, which were called latifundia, and the dispossession and eviction of the small Roman farmers affected Rome in a major way. It was not made possible by the rise of technology. In other words, the people weren't being forced off the farm by tractors, which is what we see in the 20th century, but they were being forced off by slave labor. The Roman Empire was bringing more and more slaves into Italy, and they were using the slaves as agricultural workforces, and this change in the manpower situation made it possible for larger farms, and the larger farms began to squeeze out the small ones, and it had a real interesting effect on Roman culture and the history of Rome. The Roman poet Virgil is an example of this. Virgil's father lost his farm in 40 BC in one of the very last machinations surrounding the rise of the latifundia. Virgil was forced into Rome. He had to go to Rome. He was one of the lucky few. He landed on his feet. He had a lot of talent. He got connected with some literary people. He became one of the great poets of our literature. But a lot of people didn't. A lot of people ended up in the Roman mob, which is infamous to this day as well. And it was that mob coupled with the disappearance of the small farmer who had been the backbone of the Roman army, which led to first the fall of the Roman Republic and ultimately to the fall of Rome. And obviously there's a lot of other things going on here, but I think it's important to realize that a fundamental change in the underpinnings of the agricultural aspect of society was materially and directly related to what happened to the Roman Empire is very interesting, since we live now in an empire that has succeeded that. And when you look at the English situation, it seems to me it becomes perhaps even more of a parallel, because the English stood between us. I mean, from the American standpoint, others would not view the world in this fashion, but from the American standpoint, the English stand between us and Rome as the dominant empire in the history of the period that falls in between. And the English history of agriculture very closely parallels what's happening in the United States during this century in particular. The English, for 400 or 500 years, were convulsed by a process known as enclosure. And what enclosure essentially referred to was the fencing or ditching of fields and areas which had been part of the commons, which is to say available to all the small farmers for their use to grow crops or whatever they wanted on. The eviction of those small farmers and the appropriation of that land via enclosure by the large landowning interests. And what you saw in England is very slow. I mean, something that goes on over 400 years is history at a slow enough process that it's very hard to see the individual tick of the clock. But what happened, excuse me, I'm getting myself bound up in my thoughts in my mouth, please forgive me. What happened was that the enclosure movement resulted in dispossession of hundreds of thousands of English farmers. My great-great-great-great-grandfather was one of them. Dale Burr's great-great-grandfather was another.
Some scary parallels on which I'm afraid we're going to
Well,
have
scary
to
parallels it is. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you for writing a wonderfully informative and suspenseful and immensely readable
Well,
book.
I hope you get sleep tomorrow night.
I will.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.